Okay, so this is the first aorist, active and middle. And we're going to start with the active of the first aorist. Now remember that we're dealing here with a tense that has an alternate way of forming it, and that's called the second aorist. And in the second aorist, were there any tense formatives?
No.
If you recall that term. No, there are no tense formatives. Are there connecting vowels?
Yes.
Yes. Those connecting vowels connect us from the tense stem to the personal ending. Okay, so that's why they're called connecting vowels. What we're going to learn in the first aorist is that there is actually a tense formative. The tense formative has a vowel embedded in it, and therefore there will not be connecting vowels. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at the handout here, okay? So look up here. The first aorist, active indicative. The aorist is used for past time, as we've mentioned before, just like the imperfect, but it portrays perfective aspect. That is, the action is portrayed as a bounded whole or in summary fashion without reference to the way it unfolds in time. As you know, Mounce describes this as undefined aspect, and I am not going to use that term as a general rule. The stem is the aorist active stem, and we will typically use the simple past in order to translate it. The components of the form are what you expect, at least at the beginning here. Aorists, whether they be first or second aorist, do have augments, so we know how to form those. The stem will be the aorist active stem, and that's what we use for the second aorist as well. Where we're charting new territory is with the tense formative. You're familiar with another tense formative that's almost the same as the sigma alpha tense formative, right? And which tense formative was that?
Future.
The future tense. And what was the tense formative there?
Sigma.
Just a plain old sigma. Okay, so this sigma will have an alpha attached. Future is ahead of the time of speaking. Past is temporally behind the time of speaking. So they're opposites in that way. Our connecting vowel or thematic vowel is none. There are none. Because as you know, or notice here, the sigma alpha ends with a vowel, and that vowel then is a kind of connecting vowel in and of itself. So we don't need a separate connecting vowel. And then the endings we're going to use are the secondary active personal endings. So if you remember our chart here, I'm not going to write down everything. We're focusing on the chart on the top right-hand side. Secondary, okay, versus primary, and active versus the middle passives, okay? So we're focusing on this one. So just a little layout here in a visual way. You see our augment, aorist active stem, tense formative, and then the personal endings are tagged on to the very back. Let's take a look at the forms as they occur now. So secondary active personal endings are the ones that we're going to use here, the real endings. So we take our augment, and our aorist active stem for luo is elu in all cases. Our tense formative is sa, all right? And then these are the real endings, which you've already learned. We had for the present, me, ct, mente, and nti. Here it's just mst, mente, and nt. All right? That is to say the iotas of the original real endings for the primary active tenses are dropped, and we have pretty much the same otherwise. There are going to be slight modifications here. In the case of the first person singular, just like in the present active indicative, the me ending is not used for most of our omega conjugation verbs like luo. So also in the first aorist, the first person singular doesn't actually attach the mu at the end. So we're left with just elusa, okay? so not elusam. So we'll go ahead and just walk through these forms. So first is elusa. And how would we translate this? I loosed. I loosed. Simple past time. The second form is elu plus the sa, and then the second singular is just the sigma. And thankfully, there are no modifications that happen. So it's elusas. Elusas. You loosed. For third singular, elusa should have gotten a tau on the end. What did we learn about taus at the end of a word? They drop out. Greek likes to throw in the tau when the taus are final. And so we should have been left with elusa for that after the tau drops off. But notice that it now looks exactly like the first person singular here, doesn't it? And that's not kosher, if there is such a thing as kosher in Greek. So what's happened here is that the alpha switches to an epsilon. Perhaps this is by analogy to the second aorist or the imperfect, where you have that epsilon connecting vowel that makes it look like a third person singular form. And we could have our movable nu here as well. So it becomes eluse. Eluse. So that's he, she, or it, loosed. Simple past.
So, I don't understand why that's permissible. Just casually change the rule instead of keeping it the same.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't ideal for second aorist when the singular and the plural third were the same.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
No.
Well, that is true. Although, if you remember, when we got to the word to know, the first singular was agnon, right? And the third plural was agnoson, right? Should have been agnon as well. And they modified it to conform to another third person plural ending that we're going to learn. So it's not as crazy as you might imagine to see changes like this happen. So I don't ask why. I just accept that is the way it happens, and trust that the Greek mamas were right when they passed this knowledge on. Okay, the first person plural. We have elu, sa for the tense formative, and then men. And there's no reason for the men to have to change. So we are perfectly happy to see this the right way. Now, one thing that happens is, notice, how many syllables do I have? Elusamen. I have 4. Up until this point, my accent has been on the augment, but if I left it here, what would happen? I would have an acute accent on the 4th from the end. Is that permissible in Greek? No. The acute can only go on one of the final 3. So it is going to shift over. Okay, so it'll be elusamen. Elusamen. And for the meaning, it's we loosed. Simple past. Second person plural. Elu, sa, and then I can add my personal ending te. There's no reason for that to be modified. Te can go at the end. It's not final te, tau, right? So it's good. Where's my accent going to be? It's got to go on the upsilon because I can't accent 4 from the end. So elusate. Translate that.
You loose.
You loosed, or y'all loosed.
Y'all.
All right, and then my last one, elu, plus the sa, plus the new tau. What's the new tau gonna do?
Towel's gonna drop.
Tau's gonna go away, right? Throw in the tau, and I'm left with elusan. Elusan. So that is they loosed. Okay, so those are my forms. So let's say these together. Repeat after me. Elusa.
Elusa.
Elusas.
Elusas.
Elusamen.
Elusamen.
Elusate.
Elusate.
Elusan.
Elusan.
All right, very good. So if you see elusen with the nu after the epsilon, should you think it's the third person plural form? No. because the third person plural form does retain the sigma and the alpha. It's the third singular that does the sigma epsilon. All right. So do be careful with that. All right. So that's the active. Let's just real quickly walk through the first aorist middle indicative. Remember, the aorist passives are a different chapter, and we're going to learn this separately because the aorist passive indicative uses a separate stem, the aorist passive stem, whereas the aorist active and aorist middle use the same one. They use the aorist active stem. As we've already noted, the aorist is used for past time and perfective aspect. So let's skip down here. The stem that is used for the first aorist middle is the same one we've learned for the aorist active indicative, and that's the aorist active stem. The components of the form are also going to be very similar to what we've just seen. The augment is the same. Since it's a secondary tense, it's going to be augmented, and it'll be epsilon, or we lengthen the initial vowel if the stem ends with or begins with a vowel. The stem will be the aorist active stem. The tense formative will be the same, sigma alpha. Connecting vowel will still be the same, which is none. My only difference here is that I'm going to use the secondary middle passive personal endings instead of the secondary active ones. So what are those? Main, sa, ta, metha, sthe, and da. Okay? So, a little visual. So here's our movable parts, right? The augment, the aorist active stem, tense formative, no connecting vowel slot, because we don't need one, and then the secondary middle passive personal endings. So let us look at these forms here, okay? So for the first singular, we're using elu, augment, aorist active tense stem, sigma alpha tense formative, and then main for my middle passive ending. Elu, sa, main. Can I leave my accent on the epsilon here?
No.
No, so that's going to go away, and I'm going to put it where? It's actually going to go on the alpha. It's going to go on the alpha because I have a long vowel over here. So when I have a long vowel here, I can't accent 3 from the end. It ends up going to the second one. So elusamein. Elusamein. So now this is middle. It's not passive in meaning. But we learned that in the middle voice, the subject acts and is somehow affected by the action. Whether the subject does it for one's own benefit or whether the subject performs the action on itself, those are possible middle ideas. Don't think that the middle voice means that what we often call the reflexive idea, where you literally act on yourself. You can also act in your own interest. Okay? So many people, just as a way of translating the middle voice, will translate it as something like he or I blanked for oneself. Okay? I don't really like that, but it's really hard to know how to generically translate a middle voice verb without the verb and its context. So some people would translate this as something like, I loosed for myself. All right? I loosed for myself. Okay, let's take a look at the second singular. It's elusa, but now I'm going to add the second singular middle passive ending, which is another sa sound, but it's with a sigma omicron. Now what's going to happen here? Elusa sa. Yes, this sigma that's part of the personal ending finds itself between the two vowels here, and it is going to drop out. And when it does, I'm going to be left with an alpha omicron, and when those two collide, we get contraction. What do those become? They become omega. So what I'm going to be left with is elusasa, elusaa becomes elu. So, okay, so elu so. Now, I'm going to put my accent there on that second to the last syllable. Eluso. Next, elusa is going to take for the third singular a ta ending. Now, is there any reason for this middle intervocalic tau to drop out?
No.
No. It's not a final tau, so it will not drop out either. So it gets to stay put. And I get elusata. Elusata. And again, my accent needs to be on the upsilon here. Elusata. So, I loosed, you loosed, he, she, or it loosed, with reference to some action that involves that action affecting the subject also. First plural, elu, sa, what? Here it's the middle passive, so metha. How many syllables is my verb here? Elu, sa, metha, right? I cannot, absolutely cannot keep my accent on that first syllable. Where am I going to put it?
Alpha.
On the alpha, elusamata. Elusamata. We loosed, or we loosed for ourselves.
I think I'm still a bit confused on, like when you're translating middle passive, how do you differentiate between that and the active?
Yeah, well, so here's the deal, right? In middle voice, the subject is performing the action. And that's true in the active, right? In true passives, the subject is not performing the action. Someone is doing the action to the subject, okay? So here, even though we're using what are called the middle passive endings, realize that the tense we're using those for, in this case, is just the aorist middle. So we're not learning any true passive meanings here, because we're not doing the aorist passive indicative yet. So all of these forms that are using middle passive are truly aorist middles, and that means the subject is doing the action.
So it's active still.
So it is still at least active in a sense, okay? But just realize that the difference between active and middle voice is that there is some way in which the action that the subject performs is also affecting the subject too, okay? In active voice, that's not necessarily the case, okay? Let me just give you one example, okay? If I had a sentence like this, I washed the cat. I used this the other day. I washed the cat. It's the cat that is being cleansed by my action, right? So it's an active voice verb. I am the subject. I'm performing the action, washing, and it's the cat that's being affected by it. Now, if I wanted to say something like, I washed my hands, okay? I'm the subject. I'm performing the action. That sounds very active, right? But what am I performing the action on?
Yourself.
Yes, at least on a part of myself, right? I'm washing my hands. That would be a middle voice verb, okay? Because not only have I performed the action, but there's some part of me that has been affected by the action too, you see? All right, and then if my mommy gave me a bath at the ripe old age of 40-something, I would say I was washed, and I would use the aorist passive indicative because I'm not doing anything except running. And mama's chasing me with a fire hose. What's that?
You said the example, I am washing my cat, is active. One
Yes.
of the example, I am washing my hands, is middle.
Middle, right. Or I washed my hands, right? I mean, if we keep everything past, because here we're dealing with the aorist, so we want to make sure that I don't want you to confuse the categories of tense with what we're talking about, okay? Tense doesn't matter here. It's a matter of how the subject relates to the verbal action is the matter of voice. All right? Okay. Now, for the second plural, elusa are all my movable parts, and I'm going to add the second person plural, middle ending, elusaste, right? Elusaste. Now, again, I cannot keep this accent over here, so it's going to go on the upsilon, elusaste, elusaste. And then the last one is adding not just a sigma alpha, but for the third plural, it's nta, right? Nta. There's no changes that happen here, So we can just leave it be, but I need my accent to go where it can go.
So-
Elusanta.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Why do we? I know it sounds better when we add the new to the sa, but why do we add the new sound to there instead of to keep it into? Like I know that would sound weird, but
I'm sorry, what are you talking about?
so I know it's alusanta, but what if we? Why don't we say it alusanta? Like I know that would sound weird, but wouldn't that technically?
You just gotta follow your natural.
Yeah.
reading, like-
Well, okay. The ending is nta,
Yes.
okay? But if you were syllabifying this, where would you draw your line?
San.
Yeah, I'd put my syllable division there. So that's why we're pronouncing it as elusanta,
Yeah.
okay? Not elusa nta. Although I like to pronounce this theoretically nta because it sounds fun. It's fun to do it. And it's fun to try to make my students do it. All right. So, but yeah, that's not really where the syllable division goes. It does go in between the nu and the tau.
Can we just say it like that from now on?
Elusa nta?
Mm-hmm.
Sure, if you want to. Okay. So that's really the basics, and that's actually not that difficult. Okay? What can be a bit tricky is what happens when we're adding these tense formatives to the aorist active stem when the stem has some letters at the end of the stem that are going to interact with the sigma. Then that becomes problematic, and that's what we want to look at now. So let's go to page 205 in Mounce. Okay, page 205. And we want to start looking at some of these peculiar formations of the first aorist. If you know the standard rules and operating procedures, these are technically not irregular verbs because they're following very predictable patterns. Okay, but there's matters or issues related to the stem. First things first is when we have contract stems. Okay, if we have verbs that are contract verbs, that means that their stems end with what? Okay, so the stem, and it's not the verb ends, but the stem ends with alpha, epsilon, or omicron. Okay, the lexical form of contract verbs are what? Are going to end with what? Yeah, but always with the contract vowel. A-o, a-o, and uh-oh. Right? So there'll be a-o, a-o, or uh-oh verbs. Now, in the future tense, you learn something about these contract stems before you add the tense formative. What's that?
The contract vowel lengthens.
Okay, yes. The contract vowel lengthens before tense formatives. Guess what? That's true with the aorist. Okay? So take a verb like agapao. The stem is agapa. Okay? Now I'm going to perform a number of operations on this. To make this first aorist, what do I have to do? I gotta augment. Alpha is a vowel, not a consonant. So how do I augment this? I've got to lengthen it. That's right. So what does alpha become? Alpha becomes eta. Okay, so it becomes agapa. Okay, so let's just review that. Alpha and epsilon become eta. When I lengthen, omicron lengthens to omega. Okay, so I have aga, pa. Now this alpha is going to take on a sigma alpha, and then whatever the personal endings are that I want to use. So contract vowels before tense formatives lengthen. So this alpha will lengthen to what? It'll also lengthen to eta. So I'm going to get agapesa, and then whatever personal endings I need for the active indicative. So agapesa, agapesas, agapese. Okay, I loved, you loved, he loved. Yes.
How come intervocalic sigma doesn't happen here?
Ah, good question. Good question. The place we see the intervocalic sigma dropping out are usually further down in the boundaries or the margins of the verb. So if you notice, we saw that that connecting vowel. Excuse me, that intervocalic sigma dropping out, where the sigma was part of the personal ending. So further to the end. The closer you get to the stem, you don't see intervocalic sigmas falling out there.
Okay.
Okay.
So, for the
So,
most part,
so yeah, in fact, if we go backwards, let me just point out that when we had the second singular, if you look at what we should have had with no changes, it'd be elu, sa, right? I've actually got two sigmas that are between vowels, don't I? But it's only this one that falls out.
yeah.
That one stays put. Okay.
Okay, that makes sense. So for the most part, if it's a tense formative, don't drop it.
Right.
Okay.
You need those tense formatives to know what tense you're talking about, right? So if they're falling out right and left, you can't tell anything.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, that makes sense.
All right, good. Yes.
Also, for the personal endings with an eta, like men, does that change any part of the word of agapesa, for example? Would it just be
No.
agapesa men, or-
Yeah, exactly. So let's just switch that out. Okay, so if we want to add the first person plural, so what we've got here with agapesa is first singular, right? I loved. What about we? I just add men to the end. Agapesa men. My accent would have to shift a bit, but it'd be agapesa men. Okay, so we loved. Y'all loved would be agapesa te, right? So just add that tau epsilon. Now, what if I wanted to make this middle? Okay, what would I do? Well, the augment would stay the same. My alpha of agapa would have to lengthen to the eta before I add the same sigma alpha for the aorist middle, but then I just have to use the secondary middle passive endings, right? Not the active ones. So what would be like the first person singular in the middle? It'd be main, right? So agapesa main. Okay, my accent will shift over just to that one. Agapesa main. So the front half of this stays identical in the aorist active and the aorist middle, and the whole important point is that you recognize that the contract vowel had to lengthen. Okay. Real quickly, let's just think about poieo. The stem of that contract verb to do or make is poiea. So if I want to make it first aorist active, what do? First thing is I add what at the beginning? Augment. So here I have a P, so I'm going to add the epsilon for the augment. The epsilon is a contract vowel, so it lengthens to what? It's got to go to eta. That's right. So I have poi a. Then my tense formative is sigma alpha, and then any personal ending for the active I want. I did is apoiesa. You did would be what? Apoiesas with that eta lengthened contract vowel. And we did apoiesa men, and so forth. Okay? We wanted to make it middle, we just used the middle endings. Apoiesa main. I made, or I made for myself. Okay? All right. For the next sort of strange things that the aorist can do, but really not so strange. Again, it's all predictable behavior. It's stops, stems with stops. Remember the square of stops? Okay, we saw that those stop consonants, when a sigma is added to them, like to create a new consonant that has two sounds in it. So labials Okay, plus a sigma become psi. Velars plus a sigma become xi. And dentals plus a sigma, what happens to those? It just becomes sigma. In other words, the dentals or the teeth fall out, right? So I'm just left with this sigma. So we're going to see all these sorts of situations in the first aorist, because what are we doing? We're adding not just a sigma, but a sigma alpha to some aorist tense stems that have labials, velars, or dentals on the back side of those stems. So case in point is the word blepo. What does blepo mean?
I see it.
Yeah, I see. So blep is the aorist stem. So if I want to say I saw, what do? Add the augment, blep, and then I add my tense formative, sigma alpha. What's going to happen to the P and the sigma together? It's going to become psi. Can you see it? All right. So it becomes eblepsa, and that's I saw. All right? See how that works?
Yeah.
Okay. What about grapho? Grapho has a phi, graph. So it's going to be what? Egrapsa becomes what? Egropsa, exactly. So that phi sigma becomes psi, egropsa. All right? So when you meet one of these letters with an alpha after it and a personal ending, and you see an augment on the front side, you need to be thinking, okay, I know sigma alpha is my tense formative, but sometimes that sigma is going to be obscured by the consonant that it connects with. And you have to be thinking, okay, I see eblepsa, that's really a labial plus my sigma before that alpha, okay? And so when you're working backwards to the lexical form, when you parse these, then you need to think, okay, I'm looking for a verb that's blah with a labial, either blep, blef, right, or bleb, right? Those are my three labels. Well, which verb do you know has one of those three? It's blepo with a P, okay? So that's how you're going to be working out your parsing. Dentals, when they interact with a sigma, do what? They drop out, right? Remember, dentals mean teeth, and teeth like to fall out if you don't tend to them very well. If you think of sugar, the S sigma for sugar, dentals and sugar, what will happen? Well, the dentals will fall out, right? Okay, so that's right. So we have discussed several examples of this happening. We'll do one more just to make this clear, since we haven't done one with a dental stem. How about patho? Okay, so this is I persuade. Notice that we have path for our stem. So if I want to turn this into a first aorist, what am I going to do? First thing is to add what before the stem? Augment, so it's going to be an epsilon, path. And then I'm going to add sigma alpha. And then the theta sigma combination is going to yield what? What's that? Yes, theta is a dental, so it's going to fall out. So I'm going to be left with epesa. Okay? So epesa. So there you go. I persuaded. All right? Everybody good? Happy? All right. Excellent. Let's look at 23.12 here. In this section, Mounce talks a little bit about the matter of verbs that typically are verbs that are typically second aorist that will have first aorist sorts of endings. So second aorist verbs with first aorist kinds of endings. What basically we're seeing here is situation is where the Hellenistic or Koine Greek language is in transition. Things are shifting, and so we're going to see what look like mixed forms. All right? So let's take a look at a couple of the examples here. Take the word apon. Remember, we did our ape, leg ritual the other day. Yes. So apon, yes, I see you all acting like gorillas there. Ape, or apes, leg. And apon is what kind of an aorist, a first or a second aorist? It's a second aorist, right? Second aorists have no sigma alpha. They do have a connecting vowel. You see that Omicron is our connecting vowel there. And then our nu is our personal ending here. You are going to see from time to time the form that looks like this. And if you look very closely at that, this is a second aorist that has an alpha right there. Now, where is that coming from? Well, what's happened is that this form has borrowed a first aorist type of ending. The sigma's gone, but the alpha of the sigma alpha is present, and the nu that you're expecting is also here. And this is going to happen almost 100 times in the Greek New Testament. So just be aware that sometimes second aorist verbs will borrow first aorist endings, and so it's going to have the alpha at the end, where you normally would have expected an omicron for the connecting vowel, okay? Another example is elthon. So we have a elthon from what lexical form? Erchamai, very good. So elthon is to go in the second aorist. So that's a second aorist form, but you can see that alpha nu ending instead of the omicron nu. The rest of these forms don't happen very frequently, so it's really this one that you need to be aware of, but he does give you a few examples of rarer forms that do this, okay? Just because the form is veering towards the first aorist, even though it's a second, doesn't really indicate any change in meaning. It's still an aorist, which means it's going to be translated with a simple past form, okay? All right. Was there a question? Yeah, so when you're parsing it, you could refer to it just as the aorist, or you could still call it a second aorist, but it's a second aorist that's using some first aorist forms. All right. Now, on 23.13 and 14 and 15, we are dealing with something called liquid aorist. You remember liquid futures, don't you? Okay. We need to think of this in comparison with liquid futures. First thing we have to remember is what are the consonants that are referred to as quote-unquote liquids? Okay, so lambda, mu, nu, what's the other one? Rho. Very good. Remember rho. Okay, so lambda, mu, nu, rho. Technically, mu and nu are nasals, and lambda and rho are not. All of them are going to be voiced, meaning the vocal cords will vibrate. Okay, none of them are stop consonants. Anyhow, what's the problem? Well, what did we see going on with these liquid consonants and liquid futures? What happened there? Okay, the tense formative was different for what reason? What do these liquid consonants have problems with? Yes, that's right. Liquids have problems with sigma, okay? And so because of that, we've got a difference of tense formatives. So in the future, the sigma became an epsilon sigma. And then what happened next? When we added our connecting vowels right here after the sigma, we ended up with the intervocalic sigma, and then the sigma either went to heaven or went to hell, but wherever it went, it's gone, right? So just as an example, let's take meno. What's that mean? To remain. And so I'm going to leave the men for a moment, and I've got my future stem here. And then normally, to make it future, to say I will remain, what would I do? It would be men so, right? But what happens? I get not a sigma, but an epsilon sigma because nu is a liquid. And then what happens to the sigma? It falls out, and then epsilon omega contract and become what? Meno, with a circumflex over that omega. Meno. And this is not I remain present. That is meno with the accent on the epsilon. Meno. I remain present. I'll put PAI. Meno. Accent on the final syllable. Due to contraction, circumflex here. I will remain, or I shall remain. Okay? You all remember this, don't you? All right. Well, let's talk about what liquid aorists do. Now, he is going to tell you that for liquid aorist, and he gives you the example of meno in the chart, or the box, he gives you these forms. So this is his augment, stem. What does he say the tense formative is for the liquid aorist? Alpha, and then PE for personal ending, okay? Let me just encourage you to think about this just a slightly different way, okay? I would argue that the liquid aorist tense formative actually is sigma alpha, okay? It's not really a different tense formative. What you don't need to do is you don't need to learn a new tense formative. What you just need to know is that the liquids before the sigma alpha are going to have problems with the sigma, all right? So this is a phonetic problem in Greek. The tense formative is really sigma alpha, but after the liquids, the sigma is just always going to fall out. So I don't want you to be thinking about this alpha as something different. It's really just the alpha of sigma alpha where the sigma had to go away, okay? So what happened here with meno is this. The aorist stem was actually men, and then we tried to add sigma alpha and then personal ending. So we'll stick with men for a minute. So we have men, samen. Men, samen. And that would be we remained, past time, simple past, okay? So liquids right here do not play well. They do not play nicely with sigma. Here, instead of adding an epsilon before the sigma alpha, like we added the epsilon before the sigma of the future tense formative, well, all that's going to happen here is just that the sigma will fall out. It'll completely disappear. That's why you don't see it. And then, to compensate for the loss of the nu, of the sigma. The sigma has been lost. To compensate for that, what Greek is going to do is it's going to compensatorily lengthen the vowel before the nu. And so what does it become? In this case, it's lengthened to a diphthong, epsilon iota. All right? So it becomes a menamen. So a mensamen becomes a menamen, becomes a menamen. All right? So that's the procedure here.
I guess just a little bit of confusion with the future. Why the epsilon? Why is the epsilon added?
Yeah, well, it's added to prevent the liquid and the sigma actually occurring in contiguous spots, right? Those liquids are repelled by the sigma. So the epsilon breaks it up, and then the sigma ends up falling out anyway because it's intervocalic. With the first aorist, the sigma alpha immediately following the liquid consonant at the end of the verb stem will also say, I don't want to be next to a liquid, so the sigma just drops out altogether, and it leaves the alpha there. Okay? So let me just walk you through a couple of examples of other liquids. On page 211, we have some liquid verbs. And you'll get a chance to see what happens when these are turned into the first aorist. Take a look at iro, for example. So iro. That is to lift, raise. Okay? Now, the real root here is R, like a pirate. R. Okay? They lift up the booty. Not that kind of booty. Stop that. Okay, so the aorist is going to use the real root. What's happened is the present stem has modified the real root to form the present stem. The aorist is going to retain R. Okay, so think about that for a minute. So I'm going to start with R, and I want to make it first aorist. What do I have to do? This starts with a vowel, so what will happen to it?
Lengthen it.
It will lengthen. Excellent. So what does alpha become when it lengthens? It becomes eta. Great. And then I want to add sigma alpha. Rho is what kind of a consonant, though? Liquid. And it doesn't play nice with sigma. So what will happen to my sigma? It's going to completely drop out. Now, once that happens, I'm left with era. Now, with the loss of the sigma, can I compensatorily lengthen this eta to make it longer? Is there such a thing as like a super eta in Greek? No. So that'd be really cool, wouldn't it be? So we're just going to leave that eta right where it is. And so that is our first aorist form of iro. Okay, so it's era. You see?
I understand that you can't lengthen the eta, but why can't you add another? Why can't you make it a diphthong?
Well, diphthongs are long vowels. So we made something a diphthong to make it long in the case of meno, right? But here, this is already long. Okay. Now, let's take a look at apocrinomai. Does anybody remember what apocrinomai means? I answer. Good. So we'll jot this down. Now, what kind of a verb is this when it has a prefix like apa in front of the stem? What do we call those? Starts with a C. Compound, right? Not kung pao. I know some of you are thinking Chinese food. Compound. Compound verb. Have a prefix followed by the stem. So this is the lexical form, and crin is our real root here, okay? That ends with a nu, which makes it what kind of a verb? A liquid. That's right. So if I want to turn this into the first aorist, what am I going to do? Well, the aorist stem does use the same root as the present stem is using, so there's no modifications here, which is good. So let me go ahead and get rid of this stuff, and I'm going to be left with this. Now, first thing I want to do is I want to augment. Where do I put my augment? Do I augment the alpha, or do I put the augment before the kappa?
Before the kappa.
It goes before the kappa. So can I leave the omicron right here and stick an epsilon right after it? No. What's going to happen with my prefix is if the prefix ends with a vowel like this, most of the time that vowel is going to drop out. There's going to be elision here. So we're going to get rid of that, and we're going to put the augment there. Do I need to put a smooth breathing on that augment? I don't, because it's not at the beginning of the word. So Apocrine. And then in the aorist stem, this is what Mounce calls deponent. And that simply means that in the aorist, it's going to take middle endings, even though it will have a meaning that we think of as active. So it would be sa, and then for the first person, I'm going to use the middle passive endings, main. Okay, so crin, sa, main. Now, what's going to happen here? The nu and the sigma do not like each other, do they? So the sigma will fall out. And in this case, the iota, think about iota in Greek. Is iota long or short?
Short.
And long. Iotas can be short or long. So before it lost the sigma alpha, it was a short iota. Now, guess what it is?
Long.
It's long. So it does lengthen, but you can't tell that it is a lengthened vowel, but it is. So apocrine is I answered, past tense, simple past. That's the first aorist. Okay, so you're seeing everything you're supposed to see except that sigma after the nu. Okay.
Does that accent move the alpha?
Yes.
Off the iota? Okay.
Right. So my accent has to go here on the alpha. So apocrine. All right.
And so how do we know again that it's going to take middle passive endings?
Good question. Let me direct your attention to the back of the book. So go to page, let's see, what page is this? 372. 372. When you look at page 372, you have a list of your principal parts. There are 6 columns. Which column is the aorist active indicative column? The third. Very good. In the aorist active indicative column, I should have active first person singular aorist forms. What does that mean? Third column, okay, should be aorist active indicative first singular. If it's a second aorist, what is that ending going to look like? It'll look like on, right? The connecting vowel followed by the new. If it's a first aorist, what will it look like? It'll look like sa, right? My tense formative with no first person singular ending. So if I don't have on or sa, but rather main, which is first person singular but not active, but what? Middle passive. Then that tells me that there isn't an aorist active form at all. It always uses a middle form. In other words, it's what Mounce calls deponent. So take a look at our third column on page 372. Go ahead and look there. Okay. Do you see for agapao, the aorist, the third one is should be the aorist active. It's agape sa. You see the sa. So that's active ending, right? Agagon, that has the on ending, that's active. It's second aorist active. Era, that should have a sigma alpha. Why is there no sigma? Sigma drops out because we're dealing with a liquid verb. Etesa, from itao, you see the sigma alpha. Ekaluthesa, there's my sa. Ekusa, anabino becomes anebane. That's one where I have what should have been a second aorist, but this ends up being what we called a root aorist, like egnon, if you remember that one. There's no connecting vowel, but it does use the new. What's that? Go ahead. How does it get to that form? Yeah. Well, it's from apabino. So we have apa. So you see the epsilon before the bane is the tense formative. And in the aorist, what we're left with is the beta, eta, and then we're just adding the personal endings directly to that root. Okay. All right. Now, take a look. If we keep going down, all these forms are active. But now look on page 373, third column, apocrine. Notice here I don't have apocrinsa or apocrissa. What do I have? I have apocrine. There I do see a middle ending on what is typically the active column, right? That tells me that in the aorist apocrine is quote-unquote deponent. That is to say, it uses a middle formation. It'll still mean something active in our minds. I answered, not I was answered. I answered, okay? And the next one that does that is the second from the bottom of that chart. Aspadzamai means I greet. And the third item is aspasamein. So you see the sa for the first aorist, but the main is a middle first person singular ending, not an active one. So there, that is what Mounce would call deponent also. Okay? You would translate that as I greeted, simple past, and treat it as active in meaning. Okay? Now, so your question about how do I know when I learn a verb that in the aorist active, it's actually not going to have an active ending but a middle passive. In other words, would it be deponent? You have to look at the principal parts that are given and check. You just won't know it by looking at the verb. Okay? All right. Good.
And also, on the, like, why does the saw not
Yes.
How come there's not a new at the end of the first person?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me pull a Jesus on you and ask you a question as a response to your question. I taught you guys that the first person singular active ending is really me, isn't it? Okay? But as you remember, in our verbs, like blepo, it's not blepome, but just blep plus omicron. Should have been me, the me fell out, and so the omicron has become an omega to compensate for the loss of that ending, right? So it becomes blepo. Why doesn't it use the me here? I have no idea. That's what the Greek mamas told us to do. All right? And in the same way, luo should have been elusam, but in the same way, that final ending has just not been used. And so I'm left with elusa. Okay? Now, the third singular should have been elusat. Final tau drops out, right? Greek throws in the tau. And there, that would have looked the same. And so the alpha also has shifted to an epsilon. And that allows us to tell the difference between the first singular and the third singular. Okay? So even though that mu's not being used, you won't see any other forms that look like elusa except the first singular. So it won't be too hard to identify. All right? Okay. That is the end of the chapter. And what we'll do is we'll read the vocabulary words together. Is that okay with you? Let's do that. Oh, yes. He's trying to hold us up here.
Totally.
No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Backtracking a little bit. So going back to era, I don't. Why did we put a circumflex on eta instead of acute on alpha?
So you're looking at...
We only did a second row. It starts with it's arrow, but it became era.
Yeah.
We did
Yeah.
How come we did a circumflex on eta?
So why not just an acute accent instead? Yeah. Well, the reason it's not on the alpha is that the tense formative never takes the stress unless it has to due to shifts in syllables. For example, if I add the main ending for first person middle passive, because the eta of main is long, I have to stress the syllable before that if I'm trying to stress the non-final syllable. Yeah. So elusamain, for example, right? Yeah. But if it's not a situation like that, I want to stress the syllable before the sa. So elusa, right? Or what's another one here? Let me see. Ekusa, elusa, epistusa. Yeah, I'm trying to keep my accent back on the verb stem, unless something forces me to push it further back because I have too many syllables. Right? Remember, I can't have accents more than 3 syllables from the end. Yeah. Right? And then there's issues related to vowel length that also force me to put accents either on the second to the last or the final. And so anyhow, I wouldn't ever want to stress the alpha here all by itself with nothing after it. Not a ra, but a ra. Okay? So that may not make a whole lot of sense to you right now, but if you take a look at all of these forms in the previous words, do you ever see the sigma alpha being stressed?
Apocrine is the only one.
Yeah, and that's not a sigma alpha at the end, is it?
Yeah.
So
Cross-air combined whenever it becomes liquid active, or not liquid active, but just Aorist.
Right. Yes. But those have the main. I'm just asking if you look at all the forms that end with sa, right? You never see the sa all by itself being accented as the final syllable, okay. Right? If your eyes just glance through there, you'll never see that.
So then, why do we do a circumflex instead of just a acute accent?
Yeah, that I don't know. Yeah.
That's weird.
All right. Not as weird as you think. Like if you think about this verb here that we saw just a little earlier, where'd it go? Elthon. You see, that's the syllable before the N, and that had an eta that was accented with a circumflex as well. Okay. All right, good. Let's read the vocab words real quickly. On page 209, aperchamai. So apa plus erchamai, to go away. So I depart. Archamai. Archamai. So here, archamai is in the present stem. In the present stem, it uses the middle passive endings where we would have expected an omega, right? An active one. So I begin. I begin. Now, if you look in his note, and this is important, 2 times this verb functions as a non-deponent, meaning it functions with active endings. Arco, and it means I rule in those situations. Okay, not begin, but rule. Next, everybody, grafo. I write. Dio. Therefore, or for this reason. Doxazo is I praise, honor, or glorify. If you look at doxazo for just a moment, let me just point out that what we're dealing with here is a dental stem, a stem that ends with a dental. The root is doxad. Do you see that in parentheses? He puts the asterisk next to the real root of the verb. And this is what the aorist is going to use as its stem. So when I want to make this a first aorist form, I add the epsilon, I add the sigma alpha, and the delta is a dental. Before the sigma is going to do what? It's going to drop out. So my first aorist is going to be edoxa sa. Okay? I glorified. Edoxa sa. All right? Okay, and then we have dunamis. So power or miracle. Keruso. So I proclaim, preach. And finally, pino. Pino, I drink. I think of pina colada when I think of pino. I don't encourage you to go out drinking, but if you like pina coladas, you know, you do have to drink them. Right. Okay, very good. Let's look at the homework.